Paul Ricoeur shows us an example of faithful Christian thinking that's neither defensive and reactionary against the trends of the culture on the one hand, nor does it concede too much to them in a way that compromises Christianity's sort of challenge and distinctive voice. With every new idea, movement or thinker, Ricoeur always did two things. He took it very seriously and let himself be influenced and changed by it. He took on board what new insights and truths it offered. But he also never allowed himself to be fully captivated by it. He always offered his own sort of critical evaluation, pushbacks and developments beyond it. I think this is a beautiful example of how all of us should live our intellectual lives. Serious engagement, but also critical engagement with everyone and everything, neither ignoring and dismissing, nor wholesale accepting what anyone has to say. And Ricoeur also has an astonishingly long and varied career. Can you think of any writer who has work published both before World War II and after 9/11? Ricoeur's the only person I've ever been able to think of. He was a French Protestant philosopher, was able to personally observe and comment on events in history and movements in philosophy over a period of more than 70 years, from the 1930s to the 2000s. And what makes him so extraordinary is that he's not one of those philosophers with a single idea, a single idea played out in different forms and contexts in a number of books. People often ask me, what is the one central Ricoeur book that they should read in order to know what Ricoeur thought? If they could only read one book by Ricoeur, which should it be? The answer is, it depends entirely on what you're interested in. There is no one book that summarizes Ricoeur's philosophy. He kept reinventing himself, spending 10 years working on one topic and then switching to a new topic for another 10 years. If you're interested in hermeneutics, you might want to check out Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences. If you're interested in ethics, you'll want to read Oneself as Another. If you're interested in free will, then Freedom and Nature is a good place to go. If you're interested in the problem of evil, then read Ricoeur's The Symbolism of Evil. If you're interested in one of his most famous ideas, the Masters of Suspicion, then you should read Freud and Philosophy. If you're interested in language, then try reading Interpretation Theory. If you're interested in how to engage with history, then read Memory, History, Forgetting, and so it goes on. Ricoeur wrote on phenomenology, politics, law, narrative, identity, imagination, literature, religion, the Bible, existentialism, idealism, psychoanalysis, the relationship between philosophy and theology. The list just goes on. Unlike many philosophers, Ricoeur is not only read by other philosophers in philosophy departments at universities. Ricoeur's work is used in academic discourse in the departments of literature, history, law, politics, theology, almost every humanities discipline. In this video, we're going to focus on Ricoeur's influence on theology and the ways in which his philosophy is useful for theologians. But it's worth remembering that theology is only one of many disciplines that have been decisively changed thanks to Ricoeur's thought. If you simply search for Ricoeur in a social media site like Twitter, for example, you'll see how many types of people and different disciplines and languages are referencing Ricoeur. Ricoeur's influence on theology can hardly be overestimated, but often its effects are hidden, either because he was the key influence behind the ideas of another well-known thinker like Charles Taylor, David Tracy, or Alistair MacIntyre, or because his ideas are now so famous that people know the idea without necessarily knowing that it came from Ricoeur, like the idea of a second naivete, or the phrase, the symbol gives rise to thought, or Masters of Suspicion. I would say Ricoeur is best known in theology for four things. First, his rigorous discipline in keeping the boundaries between philosophy and theology very strictly, and for providing a wealth of insights into their relationship as a consequence. Second, for his work on the problem of evil, which is one of the few decisive contributions to that question in the 20th century. Third, for bringing Marx, Nietzsche and Freud together under the heading Masters of Suspicion, for seeing them as a radical challenge to faith and for responding to that challenge. And fourth and finally, Ricoeur is probably most famous and influential for his work on hermeneutics, which is used by biblical scholars across the board, as well as by anyone who's interested in the question of how to interpret the Bible's message for today. We're going to spend some time on each of these four areas, and after that we'll end with some thoughts on what Ricoeur's implicit method can teach us about how to do academic scholarship in a distinctively Christian way. But first of all, let's take a brief look at Ricoeur's life. Ricoeur is one of those philosophers who actually has an interesting biography. Not every thinker has an interesting biography. Immanuel Kant, for example, basically did nothing in his life but write philosophy. But Ricoeur's life is deeply marked by the tumultuous events of the 20th century. He was born in 1913, lost both his parents in the First World War, and was raised by his aunt. His family were all French Protestants, a very rare breed, and were in fact descended from the Huguenots. Ricoeur remained a Protestant his entire life, in spite of playing out his career in an environment that was extremely hostile to religion and to Christianity in particular. Not only that, the few allies he had in the Christian space were all Catholics. I've heard Ricoeur referred to as the only Protestant in France, which is obviously an exaggeration, but is meant to highlight how unusual he was in this way. Now, Ricoeur's first high school philosophy teacher was a committed Catholic called Roland d'Albiez. D'Albiez is not remembered today in philosophy, but he left an indelible mark on Ricoeur in three ways. First, he was adamantly opposed to idealism and spent much of his classes attacking it. Ricoeur later thought that many of these criticisms of idealism were a bit too polemical and made a caricature out of it. But this nonetheless exposed him to a stream of thought that did not assume something many other philosophers of his generation assumed, that philosophical realism is not a tenable option. Second, d'Albiez was a Thomist and taught philosophy in a way that was rooted in Aquinas. Now, Ricoeur says decades later that in those early classes he was fascinated by Aquinas' medieval style of disputed questions, a style that starts by raising all of the strongest objections to a particular proposal and then refutes the objections one by one. We can see the effect of this style on Ricoeur's own writing. Whenever Ricoeur wants to argue in favour of something, he always starts by giving a fair representation of the strongest arguments against it. He never sets up caricatures of his opponents, but treats them fairly and presents them in a way that they would be happy with. Third, d'Albiez was one of the first philosophers to bring the work of Freud and Freudian psychoanalysis into philosophy. Decades later, Ricoeur spends years reading and writing about Freud, and the seeds of that interest were planted way back in his teenage years. Ricoeur later says that the encounter with Freud, when he was a teenager, cured him of any notion that philosophy can prove things with certainty, or set up an absolute foundation without presuppositions, or grasp the whole of reality in an objective manner. And we find this throughout Ricoeur's writings. They are always highly aware of their provisionality, their own historical situatedness, and there being only one of many valid perspectives on an issue. Ricoeur never tries to be the final word to any argument. In university, Ricoeur was trained by Léon Braunschweig, one of the foremost idealist philosophers of the time. There he was introduced to a way of doing philosophy called reflection, which is a highly rationalist type of philosophy rooted in Descartes and Kant. Ricoeur never abandons the reflective method and tries throughout his work to be rationally rigorous, even though he builds on this method later on. In fact, immediately after his degree, he encountered two completely new and different ways of doing philosophy that were on the ascendancy: phenomenology and existentialism. These also left an indelible mark on Ricoeur's method. In World War II, Ricoeur was drafted into the army, was captured by the Germans, and spent 5 years in a prisoner of war camp, separated from his wife and children. During his years in the camp, he read the work of Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl, and produced a translation into French of Husserl's major work, Ideas. When he was released at the end of the war and reunited with his family, he got a job as a school teacher for a few years before taking up a university position at Strasbourg. 10 years later, he moved to the Sorbonne in Paris. At that time, Jean-Paul Sartre was at the height of his fame and influence in philosophy and popular culture. Sartre was overtly and explicitly anti-Christian, and his philosophy constantly attacks Christian ideas and beliefs. This made the world of academic philosophy a difficult place for a Christian like Ricoeur to be in, and it is amazing that Ricoeur managed to survive and progress in his career in this kind of environment. In 1960, Ricoeur began a systematic reading of Freudian psychoanalysis because he believed it to represent a huge shift in European culture's self-understanding and a devastating critique of modernism, faith, and phenomenology all at once. By then, however, he was not the only person engaging with Freud in a philosophical way. Jacques Lacan was also styling himself as the only true Freudian and accruing numerous disciples in his lectures. RICOEUR went along to some of these lectures and was not impressed. He told a story about how one day he came home and said to his wife, "I've just returned from a Lacan lecture. I didn't understand a thing." At that very moment, the phone rang. It was Lacan, calling to ask what RICOEUR thought of his lecture. RICOEUR immediately responded, "I didn't understand a thing." Lacan hung up. When in 1963 RICOEUR published his great book called Freud and Philosophy, it did not engage with Lacan's reading of Freud at all. It has perhaps 2 mentions of Lacan in the entire book, and these really are just mentions. This is probably because RICOEUR was an ironic philosopher and didn't want to be nothing but critical, and yet he couldn't think of anything nice to say about Lacan, so he thought it best just to be silent. But this wasn't good enough for Lacan or his disciples, who became enraged and launched a fusillade of vicious attacks on RICOEUR, seeking to discredit him and destroy his career as a philosopher. They accused him of plagiarizing Lacan and then, in a self-contradictory way, of having completely misunderstood Lacan. These accusations did not bother RICOEUR, but what did really bother him was the accusation that RICOEUR was actually a theologian and Christian apologist disguised as a philosopher. RICOEUR knew that in the anti-religious environment of French philosophy at the time, this accusation could really destroy his career as a philosopher altogether. So at this point in the mid-1960s, we find a marked shift in RICOEUR's attitude to the relationship between philosophy and theology. This attitude is not a theoretical position on how the two relate, and it does not represent RICOEUR changing his mind. It's a pragmatic maneuver to keep himself in the game in a difficult and hostile situation. RICOEUR stopped mentioning any religious or Christian themes in his philosophical writings, redoubling his efforts to do pure philosophy and nothing more. He did sometimes still publish in Christian magazines, but he made the distinction clear and insisted that one should not mix genres, doing crypto-philosophy in theology journals or crypto-theology in philosophy journals. A few years after that, he became the dean of a new university in Nanterre, but things did not go well for him there. He got caught up in the 1968 riots. He was sympathetic to them, but they weren't sympathetic to him, and in the middle of the tensions he ended up resigning. Soon after that, the University of Chicago in America offered him a prestigious chair, the John Nuveen Chair in Philosophical Theology, and he entered the world of English-speaking theology as a result. But there's an irony about him taking up this chair, because the term philosophical theology is something that he hated, for the reasons we've already seen. He called it a schizophrenic title and said that his own work on the relationship between philosophy and theology contradicts the very idea of philosophical theology as a possible discipline. But he still accepted the position. And the fact that he was offered it proves one thing. Everyone who was reading his work saw it as philosophical theology and wanted him to keep doing that sort of thing. This reminds me of earlier accounts of Augustine resisting being made a bishop. Sometimes the people around us know what we're good at better than we ourselves do. The same problem keeps recurring, no pun intended, throughout RICOEUR's life. For example, in 1986, he was invited to give the prestigious Gifford Lectures, which are meant to be on natural theology in the widest sense of the term. Again, the whole idea of natural theology is something he did not agree with, and RICOEUR never saw himself as a theologian. But again, he accepted the invitation. He gave 10 lectures that he considered strictly philosophical, that did not require anyone to accept or reject any tenet of the Christian faith. These were later published as one of his most celebrated books, Oneself as Another. But he also gave 2 further lectures, which shifted to an explicitly Christian perspective, that he called Biblical Faith. He refused to publish these in the same volume as Oneself as Another, because of his commitment not to mix genres, so you can only find these essays elsewhere in RICOEUR's corpus. RICOEUR published his last book in 2003 and died 2 years later at the age of 92. To this day, he remains one of the most influential and greatest French philosophers of the 20th century, and this in spite of the huge disadvantage of his Christian faith in a time which was deeply hostile to religion and to Protestantism in particular. Even if we don't find ourselves in the same historical situation as RICOEUR, we can still learn a lot from him about the need for scrupulous rigour in knowing what counts as philosophy and what counts as theology, and how the two ought and ought not to interact. RICOEUR resisted any attempt to do apologetics, if this is understood as the claim to prove on philosophical grounds the truths of the Christian faith that are given only by revelation. RICOEUR saw this as a disingenuous and bad scholarship, because the apologist already knows in advance what the conclusion of their argument will be, and is not really taking seriously the opposing arguments or letting themselves be influenced by them. RICOEUR didn't believe that the Christian faith can be proven philosophically, because if it could, why would we need faith? But faith is not an isolated case here. RICOEUR didn't believe that philosophy could prove anything in a kind of apodictically certain way, because such a notion misunderstands the finitude of the human condition and the contingent and provisional basis of all our philosophizing. You might think that RICOEUR is sounding quite Barthian here, seeing theology as a kind of radical interruption that philosophy or natural reasoning can do no preparation for. And it is true that RICOEUR was influenced by Barth. You could hardly be a Protestant in the 1930s and not be influenced by Barth, since Barth was the most prominent voice in the field. And RICOEUR did find Barth helpful in showing him that theology does not need to build on an ever-shifting philosophical foundation that determines in advance what theological ideas are reasonable and what should be rejected. Theology should never let itself be squeezed into the mould of any particular philosophical position, especially one that dictates which theological beliefs are true and which are false. But RICOEUR was ultimately no Barthian. He had far too much respect for the importance and value of philosophy than that. He saw clearly that theology always does presuppose certain philosophical ideas, whether it realizes it or not. Ideas about how the human mind relates to reality, about the limits of human reason, about what history is, what a human person is, and other such fundamental questions that influence all our thinking and beliefs. A theology that refuses to engage with philosophy will, paradoxically, be most captive to philosophical ideas, because it will suffer the illusion of being free. Moreover, whatever philosophy discovers as true remains true when you add the insights of revelation to it. If philosophy discovers, for example, that to be human means to be free, or that to be guilty means to assume that I could have behaved differently, then theology can build on these insights and enrich our understanding of them, but it cannot erase them and replace them with something else. If the very concept of God is incoherent philosophically, then it does not become coherent simply because you call it theology. Philosophy can sometimes overreach itself in determining the idea of God, but if philosophy remains open and aware of its own limits, then it can serve as a necessary preparation for theological thinking. In other words, RICOEUR wanted to preserve the rightful place of both philosophy and theology, in a world where philosophers like Hegel were regularly trying to absorb theology entirely into a philosophical system, and where theologians like Barth were giving zero legitimacy to philosophical thinking at all, seeing philosophy as little more than a misguided attempt to find truth without divine revelation. RICOEUR insisted again and again that both discourses have their place, and neither can erase the other or absorb the other into itself. But RICOEUR also, unlike Barth in theology, or Kant or Bertrand Russell in philosophy, saw a productive and fruitful relationship with the two, if they talked to each other. RICOEUR did not want to silo them both off in separate compartments without any communication. And throughout his work he shows what right insights they can offer to each other if they dialogue, without compromising the distinctive identity of each discipline. There's always room for theology, because philosophy can't conclusively prove or disprove religious tenets. So being a Christian is not a disadvantage or a handicap compared with being an atheist. Both Christians and atheists have positions that they cannot prove, but which impact the way they do philosophy. Everyone is in the same boat. As far as apologetics goes, RICOEUR saw himself as following Anselm's idea of faith-seeking understanding and Pascal's idea of a wager. But he understands the Pascalian wager very differently to modern analytic philosophers. RICOEUR sees a wager as being an unprovable position that one takes, from which one seeks to explain the rest of reality. He puts it this way at the end of Symbolism of Evil. I wager that I shall have a better understanding of man and of the bond between the being of man and the being of all things if I follow the indication of symbolic thought. That wager then becomes the task of verifying my wager and saturating it, so to speak, with intelligibility. In return, the task transforms my wager. In betting on the significance of the symbolic world, I bet at the same time that my wager will be restored to me in the power of reflection, in the element of coherent discourse. So to wager in this sense means to base all your thinking on an unproven assumption. If your bet pays off, you will shed light on reality that you could not have done if you hadn't made the assumption. The proof of the value of such an unproven position lies in whether it illuminates reality or not. This is strongly reminiscent of C.S. Lewis's famous quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." This means that even though we do not have to prove our Christian faith, we cannot simply rest in the fortress of a naive fideism that renounces any responsibility for hard thinking and can never be challenged, corrected, or undermined. On the contrary, the truth of Christianity is always and perpetually put to the test by whether or not it makes better sense of the world than any other intellectual position. Is Christianity helping me understand myself, my culture, my reality better than I would have understood it otherwise? If not, then this casts doubt on its truth. If so, then it lends credibility to the Christian claims. RICOEUR puts it this way. Christian revelation is revealed insofar as it is revealing. It calls for verification of its revealed origin by its revealing power. The Holy Spirit is not an arbitrary and absurd commandment. He is discernment. As he addresses himself to my intelligence, he invites me in my turn to practice discernment. RICOEUR points out that this is a completely different approach to the kind of apologetics that tries to build upwards from philosophy to proving the truths of Christianity. He calls it leading reflection without a break from knowledge to belief. Instead, RICOEUR boldly starts from a Christian perspective and then shows how this perspective yields greater understanding of the world. RICOEUR calls this an Anselmian schema, one which starts from faith and then seeks understanding. So how does this work in practice? The first place RICOEUR tries to show that a Christian perspective yields greater understanding is when it comes to understanding the origin of evil. RICOEUR's book, The Symbolism of Evil, is one of the most significant and influential books on the problem of evil that came out in the 20th century. He published it in 1960 as part of his larger project, which he called The Philosophy of the Will. He wanted to see the precise joint at which the natural and good limitations of a finite human will are infected by evil. A lot of philosophers at the time, mostly in analytic philosophy and logical positivism, were wrestling with the problem of evil and seeking to explain it by means of a larger system of thought, showing how evil forms part of a schema of reality. RICOEUR went in a radically different direction by saying that evil can't be explained, shouldn't be explained, that if we're trying to make sense of evil, then we haven't really understood what it is. It's the very essence of evil, RICOEUR says, that it ought not to be, that it doesn't belong in this universe, and thus by its very nature it breaks apart any complete system of thought. You can't show how something naturally arises from reality if it's not supposed to be there. That's contradictory. So RICOEUR does something that is very bold in the context. He claims that evil, by definition, cannot be explained or understood philosophically. This is a remarkable move for several reasons. But one of the really interesting consequences is that the problem of evil then becomes a problem in the sense of an unexplainable mystery, not just for Christians, but for anyone and everyone. It's not a distinctively Christian or theological issue. No matter who you are or what you believe, evil is a problem that breaks apart your worldview and does not allow you to say you've figured everything out. But just because we can't explain evil in a completely intellectually satisfying way does not mean we should stop talking about it. On the contrary, the mysteries that are impenetrable to thought are precisely the things we ought to talk about, because they provide food for thought. Evil in this sense is a symbol. Now, RICOEUR uses the word symbol in a very precise and particular way. In fact, this is his other great contribution and innovation in the same book. It's a weird sort of book, because you can read the symbolism of evil without being interested in evil at all, because you want to know about his theory of symbols. Or you can read it without being interested in symbols and because you want to know about the problem of evil. RICOEUR invents a completely new and groundbreaking method, which he calls symbolism, and then applies that method to a particular case study, that of the problem of evil. If you're inventing a new method, then you have to show how it works using a concrete example, but then you risk making the book about the example rather than the new method. That is why the symbolism of evil is actually about both. It's about a new method, and it's about how that method sheds light on the problem of evil. So let's talk about the method for a second. RICOEUR's method is summarized by the saying, "The symbol gives rise to thought." Le symbole donne à penser. This saying has become so famous that it is used by people who don't even know that it comes from RICOEUR. In fact, RICOEUR didn't think of himself as inventing it. He saw it as a neat summary of an idea coming from Kant's critique of the power of judgment. The idea is simply that a symbol is something that did not originate in philosophy and cannot be made completely transparent to philosophy, but that nonetheless generates philosophical ideas and illuminates our understanding of the world. Recall what we said earlier about the test of Christian truth is whether or not it illuminates the rest of reality. Well, that's essentially the function of a symbol. Like the midday sun, it's too bright to see clearly, yet it enables us to see everything else clearly. RICOEUR wants to argue that evil is a symbol. It is not something that philosophy could ever have invented, because it doesn't make sense and causes immense problems for philosophy. But if we think about it, it will help us understand what it means to be human better than if we ignored it or falsely imagined we had solved it. We don't have time here to go into the various symbols for evil that RICOEUR finds and discusses, but that is the frame for the book. It is immensely theological for a philosophy book, because it spends a lot of time analysing the biblical story of the fall in Genesis 3 and drawing out various lessons about the origin of evil. And theologians have always found this book to be a crucial dialogue partner when thinking about the fall and original sin, as well as about the problem of evil. But Genesis 3 is not the only Bible passage RICOEUR discusses. As a Protestant, RICOEUR is deeply immersed in the Bible and concerned about how to interpret it well. But as a philosopher, he is interested in the deeper principles of interpretation of any text and the structures of the human mind that constitute interpretation. So when he writes about hermeneutics, he writes what we call general hermeneutics. His theories are descriptive and not prescriptive. He doesn't want to tell you how you ought to interpret a text. He wants to tell you how you do interpret, whether you realize it or not, whether you want to or not. He wants to describe the fundamental structures of interpretation and how knowledge is transformed as it passes from author to text and from text to reader, all taking place within a wider reality that the text is trying to unveil. This means that there are 4 factors to consider whenever you interpret: the author, the text, the reader, and the reality that the text is about. He summarizes this 4-fold hermeneutic by saying that all communication whether speech or text, is when someone says something to someone about something. You need to think about all four elements if you want to understand what is going on. All four elements have an effect on the meaning of the text. RICOEUR is quite controversial here, at least in the realm of biblical scholarship, because he argues that the reader plays a role in constituting the text's meaning just as much as the author does. This doesn't mean that a text can mean anything you like. There can be wrong or false interpretations, ones which misconstrue what the author originally meant. But because the text is appropriated into the world of the reader, its meaning is only actualized when the reader understands it in their own language, terms, and thought world. For example, the Bible tells us to love God. Our modern definition of love usually means how you feel, but in Bible times the word love was more of a commitment to a certain behavior. So we misunderstand that verse if we think it is telling us to feel a certain way. But we cannot stop at the level of exegesis and authorial intention. This is because the text is not just talking about the author's mind, but about things out there in the real world, e.g. trees, love, meat, family. And the reader's understanding of them arises from their own life experience, not the author's. For example, my understanding of a text which talks about meat will be different if I had never eaten meat, or if I eat it every day but have never killed an animal, or if I regularly kill animals for meat. Or in my previous example about love, my understanding of love depends on how and whether I have experienced love in my life. If I have not experienced love, then no matter how accurately love is described in a text, I cannot be said to understand the word. The meaning of the text changes depending on the situation and life experience of the reader. Now, it doesn't totally change, because the author's intention and the external reality of meat, for example, also contributes to the meaning of the text. But the reader's context and experience also play an essential part in what a text means. Now, this has important consequences for theology. We need to remember that the goal of interpretation is not just to understand what a text meant in its original context. That is only the first step, laying the groundwork. RICOEUR thought that biblical scholarship had somewhat lost its way because all it was doing was giving us historical facts and information about the context out of which the Bible was written, which RICOEUR referred to as the world behind the text. But this renders the Bible irrelevant and boring, a dry and useless document that does not help us live our lives. RICOEUR is not saying that we should ignore biblical scholarship. It's essential because without it we can naively make all kinds of mistakes when we read the Bible. Biblical scholarship irrevocably takes our naivety from us and we can never go back to it. But what we want, RICOEUR says, is a second naivety, a recovery of the life-giving power of Scripture after the loss of the first naivety. RICOEUR summarizes this in a very famous line. He says, "Beyond the desert of criticism, we wish to be called again." In other words, we care about what the Bible says because we want it to transform our understanding of reality and affect how we think about things in our own time. What matters ultimately is not what the text meant back then, but what it means for us now. What we want when we interpret is not the world behind the text, which classical biblical scholarship gives us. What we want is the world in front of the text, meaning the world revealed to us by the text, the world in which we live. Finally, we come to the fourth major contribution RICOEUR made to the theological scene. The way he identified a cultural shift in understanding brought about by three people he referred to as the masters of suspicion: Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. Taken together, these three provide a devastating criticism of the arrogant pretensions of modern thought to grasp reality in its fullness. Modern philosophy began with Descartes, who believed he had found an unshakable foundation for knowledge. Descartes sought this foundation by the method of doubt, and he believed he had doubted everything he could. The only thing he could not doubt was consciousness, and so consciousness is the firm basis on which to build all knowledge. Consciousness is transparent to itself. To be conscious means to be conscious that you're conscious. But the masters of suspicion showed that Descartes had not doubted nearly enough. They exposed consciousness to a great humiliation by showing that it is not transparent to itself, that it is subject to self-deception and unconscious motivations and dark desires that it does not want to admit to itself. These dark desires drive us to interpret reality in a certain way that allows us to avoid difficult and painful truths about ourselves. Consciousness, in other words, is actually false consciousness, that's RICOEUR's phrase, a surface-level pretense, a sham, a mask that we put on to cover up the shameful and horrible truth about ourselves. We make excuses for our behavior and our lifestyle, and then believe those excuses so completely that we forget the unpleasant truths that they cover up that would be too horrible for us to bear knowing. But RICOEUR notes that this devastating tear-down of Enlightenment pretensions is also a critique of religion in all its forms. Because religion also makes claims about ultimate reality that, according to the masters of suspicion, turn out to be simple wish-fulfillment desires. We project our idea of fatherhood onto an imaginary and invisible Father God and fulfill our desire for omnipotent protection. We project our idea of the perfect human onto the figure of Jesus. We project our wish for justice onto eternity and the doctrine of the final judgment. But it's all illusion and delusion, according to the masters of suspicion. It's just a manifestation of our unconscious desires and does not refer to reality at all. Now, RICOEUR fearlessly confronts these critiques of Christian faith, believing that we have nothing to lose and everything to gain by pushing them to their limits. He insists that we should see Freud, Marx and Nietzsche not as a threat to faith, but as a gift from God to bring us to a renewed faith. He puts it this way: a destructive hermeneutics is justified according to the requirements of faith. This is because, he says, all three clear the horizon for a more authentic word, for a new reign of truth. A faith purged of its delusory and illusory elements is a faith shaken until only the unshakable remains. Insofar as what they say is true, it destroys false idols and clears the way for the true and living God to appear. RICOEUR puts it this way: today we can no longer hear and read the signs of the approach of the Holy Other, except through the merciless exercise of reductive hermeneutics. Such is our helplessness and perhaps our good fortune and joy. In other words, to humbly and repentantly accept the truth in their words is a necessary path that we must walk, the dark night of the soul, our Good Friday experience, without which we cannot hope to see the light and to wake up on Easter Sunday.
I'm delighted that the St John's Timeline has now found a new home. We are working with the Christian publisher Hymns A&M, and the new website hosts all the videos we have produced over the last 12 years, including plenty of new material. There is over 160 videos, 100 hours of quality content, which we are known for. There is a low annual subscription fee, and all the profits will be going to produce new videos. The link to stjohnstimeline.org is in the video description below.